This episode is sponsored by Volunteero, the volunteering management platform that helps you spend less time lost in spreadsheets and drowning in emails and more time developing your volunteering program and delivering impact. Whether you're coordinating 20 volunteers or 20,000 volunteers, Volunteero makes it simple to onboard, train, deploy, communicate, and report all in one easy-to-use platform. Today's episode of the Time for Impact podcast is proudly sponsored by Investing in Volunteers, the UK's quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Check out more of their information updated regular on their LinkedIn page, and stay tuned to hear more about how IIV helps organisations create great volunteer experiences later in the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next edition of the Time for Impact podcast. And this is Chris Wade here. And of course, my co-host, Matt Cobble, is here as well. Hi, Matt. How are you this evening?
Hi, Chris. I am good this evening. I am enjoying our new video approach to our podcast as well.
It's good to hear. Certainly our listeners and watchers hopefully are as well. So as listeners will know, every episode we try to bring somebody or something that's shining a light on new ways of thinking, innovation, or just some big thinking around volunteering and the concept of involving individuals in their communities and in the causes that we all love and work and enjoy. And, well, I can see he's nodding. Today's no exception.
I don't know about that. There might be. We'll see.
Today's guest, as you've just heard, is John May from Cats Protection, the Chief Exec of Cats Protection. Hi, John. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Matt. Lovely to see you both.
It's great to have you here. I think you might win the accolade for the most letters and honours after your name of any of our guests we've had so far.
Well, certainly shortest surname.
Yes, your name, your first and second name are pretty short, but then you're probably CVO, OBE, DL might actually be longer than those put together. I haven't counted, but it's good. Clearly, a man of great influence and importance, and I'm sure you'll bring some of those things to us as we get going. John, we like to hear from our guests a bit about their history and I suppose their journey into, yes, charity, but into volunteering and social action in particular. So it'd be nice if you could tell us a bit of your backstory. What brought you into this sector that we all love?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because I think for so many of us in the sector, trying to separate out what we're paid for and what we do as volunteers is often quite difficult. And both, for me, have fed each other over 40 years and more now. So I started volunteering properly in order to get my Gold Duke of Edinburgh Award. When I was at university, I volunteered with the Scouts and was a Cub Scout leader in the city, Bristol. And I was reading drama at university and thought I was going to become a Blue Peter presenter. But it never happened. And instead, I discovered that I really, really liked working with young people. And so I trained as a teacher. Became a head teacher when I was 28 years old, then left teaching about in my sort of early to mid 30s to go and work for my first professional role within the voluntary sector, which was as the director of community campaigning and education at Business in the Community, one of the Prince of Wales's then charities. And I've run a number of different voluntary organisations, mainly involved with youth since then. And about 3 years ago, or a little bit more, I looked, first of all, at how much longer I have to work and be paid for it. And as you can tell by the lack of hair on my head, it's only 2 or 3 more years. And so I thought to myself, well, why don't I do something just a little bit different in the sector? And so having spent the whole of my career being the subject matter expert and being the lead practitioner in charities, I took up the offer of becoming the chief executive of Cats Protection, where I'm dotty about cats, obviously.
Yeah.
But and if Blenheim, my black and white cat, comes and talks to us during this evening's conversation, you'll discover that I'm dotty about cats. But what's been fascinating is being the chief executive of an organisation where the expertise lies somewhere else, and that's been just an enormous privilege, really, to work with folks. We have 1,000 staff and 10,000 volunteers, so it's quite a big charity, and it's been going through quite considerable change, mainly because I think volunteering is changing in the UK, and I want us to be an exemplary voluntary organisation. So, we've been doing some stuff. That's the history, really. Sideways, I continued volunteering for the Scouts and have volunteered for the Scouts now for 45 years and have done a whole variety of different roles. Matt, I know that you've been very involved with Scouting. Within the UK Scouts, I was its international commissioner for a few years, which meant I was like its sort of ambassador. And I was a trustee, and I chaired the committee that was to do with programme and development for many years. But eventually I was asked if I would move into global trusteeship, and I ended up as vice chair of the World Scout Organisation. At that time, responsible for about 65, 70 million young people around the world doing pretty amazing things. So, yeah, what a wonderful set of experience it was.
And you're a High Sheriff in Oxfordshire.
Well, I am for another 9 days or so.
Oh, are you? Oh,
well,
a bit more than
that. A couple of weeks. But I've been High Sheriff in Oxfordshire for the last year. High Sheriff is a fascinating voluntary role. It's the oldest civil appointment by the King in the country. It goes way back before 1066. There's been a High Sheriff in Oxfordshire and in every other county of England and Wales every year since the Norman Conquest. I have a list of names of everybody who's served, and originally it was an extremely powerful role, and in fact rife with corruption, which is where the bad Sheriff of Nottingham comes from, and so on and so forth. And if you look at Magna Carta, half the clauses in Magna Carta have nothing to do with managing the king and have everything to do with taking power away from high sheriffs. So they really were quite dangerous people because they were responsible for raising taxes, raising militia for the king and for justice. So they pretty much had a stranglehold over every single citizen. Well, Magna Carta shifted the power to a number of different people. Nowadays it's ceremonial, and I have the privilege of being able to use the power of convening, which we've all heard of, but my goodness me, I've discovered it's true. If the High Sheriff writes to you and says, I'd really love you to come to breakfast to talk about young people and their needs, people say yes. And so for the past 12 months, that's what I've been doing, trying to help the brilliant organisations here in Oxfordshire to get people round the table who ought to be talking to each other, but maybe don't always have to do so.
That sounds fascinating, John. And I think the notions of power in a volunteering context and I guess the importance of convening is probably two topics that Chris and I talk a lot about in this podcast, and I'd love to explore them a little bit further later on in our conversation today. I thought it might be good opportunity. You touched on Catch Protection, things changing, wanting to be an exemplar volunteer organisation. I'd love to hear a little bit about, what's afoot and what that looks like for you and the journey Cats Protection are on in that kind of space. I'd probably caveat it by saying, for me, it's a really important and interesting organisation. I have some close family friends that are currently fostering some cats for Cats Protection.
Brilliant.
I mean, what I think is really interesting about that is I don't think they would think of themselves as volunteers. So I think that in itself is quite an interesting situation. So I'd love to hear your take on Cats Protection and volunteering.
Well, funnily enough, I mean, we've just been talking about power, and I think there's a really interesting, I'm going to say shift, but I think that's probably unfair, but development in terms of the power. My Cats Protection is nearly 100 years old. It was started 1927 by an amazing woman called Jessie Wade, who was a suffragist and activist for women's rights, but an activist for animal welfare as well. And she gathered people together in a meeting room at, I think, Westminster Central Hall in London, founded this great organisation. And of course, it has a very Edwardian name. Cats Protection, feels solid. And for many, 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 many years, the organisation existed entirely run by volunteers, like so many voluntary organisations.
Right.
And of course, it then developed to realise that it needed a secretariat. And so the volunteers started employing staff. And then I guess probably, like so many voluntary organisations in the mid-70s to early 80s, the professionalising of the sector hit. And for the very best of reasons, the organisation was beginning to employ veterinary experts and those that were expert in running organisations. And the power pendulum shifted from the volunteers to the staff. And I came in 3 years ago, requested by the trustees to have a look at that relationship and to see if we couldn't create a middle way that recognised the expertise and the experience of both sets of people. Complicated, of course, by the fact that many of our staff also volunteer for the charity. So, it's never entirely clear cut. But I've always felt in the various organisations that I've had the privilege to run, charities really, really succeed when staff and volunteers recognise and are able to work in partnership because of the experience and expertise that both bring to the mission and vision of the charity. And that when that balance is not right, that's when you get uncomfortable tension and uncomfortable power play. And so I've been working with some absolutely brilliant volunteer and staff colleagues over the past 3 years, resetting that expectation. Unlike voluntary organisations like the Scouts and the Guides and the Duke of Edinburgh's Award and other organisations with which I have a good deal more familiarity, the engagement of volunteers through the warp and weft of the management of cats protection was actually quite limited. So we had trustees and we had an advisory council and board in terms of strategy, and we had loads, and we had 10,000 volunteers supporting activity at direct service provision level. But we had very little volunteer engagement through the rest of the governance and the decision making and the creativity in terms of product development within the organisation. And that's been shifting. And it's been so exciting to see the way in which both staff and volunteers have gripped that opportunity and are being really creative and really generous in recognising what each are bringing. It's probably been, got to be honest, it's probably been one of the most exciting 3 years I've had in my...
Well, there you go. I certainly, when I read your organisational annual reports and strategies and things, the words of partnership, movement building, those come through loud and clear. And it's quite nice to hear that you've found that that it's been embraced by both staff and volunteers, because quite often when you do that kind of change, and absolutely Matt and I would entirely endorse that, because who really knows the needs of local communities, local cat owners, as well as local cats, I imagine, better often than the people who are working alongside them. And you say you can couple that technical expertise that veterinary experts might bring, the organisational ability that staff and actually sometimes volunteers also bring, along with that lived experience. And I think if you can get that magic formula to work really seamlessly, then that always works quite well. But sometimes, especially in organisations where there's been a gap, that hasn't happened for many, many years, not just staff, but also volunteers get kind of conditioned into the roles that they've been dealt since.
Yeah.
And it's quite hard. Sometimes volunteers look a little bit lost when they're suddenly given the power to change things or to offer advice or influence things. So did you find that, and how did you sort of take them on that journey so that they hopefully now feel really confident to play that increased partnership role to the full?
Yeah. And of course, everybody is on a journey at a different speed. And we're not a set of federated charities. We're one charity, but nevertheless, we have individual branches around the country, right the way across the United Kingdom, as well as cat centres, which are, if you like, larger operations. And it's perfectly true to say that, different people will have different perspectives on what's working and what isn't, and so on and so forth. And there is a real challenge, because I think you're bang on, Chris. Those that know best are often at that direct service provision space and understand their local communities better than anybody else can. But at the same time, as the largest cat welfare organisation in the country, and one of the country's leading animal welfare organisations, we have a responsibility in terms of animal welfare that we cannot shirk and we cannot abdicate. And so part of, I think, getting it right is making sure that people are able to effect local decision making, particularly about a cat in crisis or a family in crisis, really quickly and be really responsive, but are able to do so within a set of guidelines and guardrails that keep themselves safe, keep the animal in the best possible space that it can be, and ultimately have the best outcomes for cats and people. And of course, we won't get into the, too much of the technical detail of our mission and vision and so on. But I know that we are perceived by the general public, and I mean, you've mentioned it, Matt, as friends who foster and so on and so forth. We're seen as this charity that is really about rehoming cats, and our people, volunteers and staff, are quite rightly really, really proud of what they do to enable that to happen. But we also have to recognize that putting a cat in a pen and waiting for a new owner is a very stressful experience for that animal. It is not a space that cats want to be in. Our people want to find the very, very best new owner for any cat that comes into our care. And part of the challenge, I think, is actually helping people to just loosen up a bit and recognize that in many, many cases, it isn't about perfection, because actually placing a cat in a safe environment is better than keeping that cat in care. So the desire by people to want to make sure that the placement is perfect is probably actually working against the mission and vision of the organisation. And then the other big piece for us at the moment, strategically, is recognizing that if we're really going to have an impact on the nation's cats, then our responsibilities go a long way beyond our direct service provision. And that actually, again, as such a big organization, we have a massive responsibility in terms of education, advocacy, and influence. And so we are right at the moment really interrogating our education strategy. And where we know that a number of charities are having to cut back their education programs, what we're doing is actually expanding dramatically and recognizing that we're in the game of human behavior change. And there are 11 million, roughly 11 million owned cats in this country. So, we directly support a tiny part of that. But what we can do is we can help people be better owners and understand cats as a species and what makes a cat truly happy in its own circumstances, and recognize, that cats don't always want to live in somebody's home. Lots and lots of cats like to live on farms and have a much, much more free range life than the traditional pet. And that's okay. That's good for the species. So helping the general public to understand that cat they see that they first of all think is a stray may not be. It may be living its best life. And we need to recognise and celebrate.
And what role do volunteers play in that education?
Well, I mean, absolutely massive, not just in terms of delivering those messages. And we hope that we will be able to encourage more people to come and volunteer for us because they'd really like to be part of that part of the mission. But also we're working with volunteers to develop our new strategy and to write the new materials and to be part of the creative process so that we really get that message properly honed. And I have to say, my own experience of being a volunteer with the Scouts nationally and writing program material and being part of that creative process that ultimately would be delivered by people like me working directly with kids, I think has undoubtedly coloured my own view about the engagement of volunteers in, what is creative product.
I'm assuming that's a good way of sort of challenging some of that sort of lived experience that we talked about as before into something that's kind of structured, but in the nicest possible way, also audited a little bit so that your reputation and animal welfare is also kind of enhanced within that kind of model. So it's a way of empowering people within boundaries, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a way of widening the demographics of volunteers, because you mentioned that people might not see themselves as volunteers when they're fostering for us because it feels like it's a full-time job, even if they're unpaid. But they probably don't see it as volunteering. It's something else. And to be able to do that, you need time and you need space and you need resources and so on and so forth. I think that we can widen and ensure that we genuinely have some really interesting diversity amongst our volunteers if the opportunities that we provide are also more diverse. And so it isn't about asking the same people to do more. It's genuinely about saying, look, this is an organization that actually you really could give your time and talent to in a very different way from the way in which you might expect this charity to want it.
I think that's really interesting. And I often, because you're a membership organisation as well, aren't you?
Well, yes, we are. Although membership of the organisation is fascinating because it's quite historic, and you're a member of the organisation if you pay a particular amount of money per year and you receive our magazine. So our members are really wide and varied. And there are an awful lot of people. It's a little bit like the National Trust. You know, you probably don't think of yourself as a member of the National Trust if you have that card that gets you entry into places. Now, I mean, I have my National Trust card. I've never attended an AGM. I've never felt I wanted to be involved in the governance of the organisation. And I don't volunteer for it. My National Trust membership is something else. And there are a lot of folks who support cats protection through membership who probably don't see themselves as members.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, John, because I think some of the conversations I've had with membership over the years are almost the absolute opposite of what you've just described. So like people would see membership as the card and as the product that you gain from it, and not the sort of the active participation in shaping the organization. I suppose the reality is it's both of those things, right? But it's an interesting, I know there's lots of interesting conversations more generally going on about sort of value propositions of membership and strategic positioning of membership and, across the sector.
Well, it's both and more, isn't it? You know, I mean, strictly speaking, that's what membership is. That, if we're going to look at the product, that's what it is. And there may be a whole lot of folks who volunteer for us who actually aren't members, which is curious because they are the lifeblood of the organisation. One of the things that we're right in the middle of, and anybody from a charity background who is listening to this podcast, when I say the three initials CRM, will just sigh. But we are now going through the process of putting in place a new CRM because our old systems didn't recognise the different ways in which people supported the work, the vision and mission of the charity. I've got to say, at the moment, it's going really well. The process is, I'm not going to say it's seamless because anybody who has ever put in any kind of system will know how challenging it is. We have the most amazing team led by one particular person who I won't embarrass by mentioning. They have really worked hard to make sure, for instance, that all parts of the charity have been involved really early on and have their own champions as we've worked through that process, so that we genuinely understand what the needs of the charity are in terms of the database. And for the first time, I'm a good example. For the first time, the charity will recognise that I am not 5 people because I have adopted, I have donated, I have taken part in the fun run, and at the moment, all of those sit separately. And I am a member of staff, and I occasionally volunteer relatively locally. So 5 roles, each separate, no kind of understanding of what sort of contact I'm getting. I always love it when I receive a stuff through the post that has come from me.
Yeah.
It's a delight.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, John, that you seem so passionate about all of these different things. And it's obvious when I say it like this, but I don't think it always comes across when I hear everyone talk about this, is this kind of how all of these roads, all of these different functions of charities, whether it's membership, whether it's the CRM, whether it's how we make decisions, whether it's the partnerships we create, whether it's the different kinds of offers we make, whether it's diversify things, how all of that goes back to almost the power of people and how the power of people is the enabler for the mission. I just think that's a really refreshing thing and to hear you articulate.
Well, and that goes right back to 100 years ago and our founder. So it's in the DNA of the charity. I think where we have shifted slightly in the past few years is recognizing when we're looking at beneficiaries, we will always be at the heart of things, an animal welfare organization. And what we care about is the world, people seeing the world through cats' eyes.
Yeah.
That's how we describe it. But we also recognize that as companion animals, cats may be choosy, but they are the most wonderful, wonderful companion animals. And they are part of, many, 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 many cats, 11 million cats are part of people's families. The impact that we have, not just on animal welfare, but also on the well-being of human beings, is a really, really important part of what we do. So strategically, as we've been looking at our direct service provision, I'm really proud of some of the more niche services that we have either continued to develop or begun to bring into the system over the past few years. And in particular, we have a program that's called Lifeline, which operates to support survivors of domestic abuse. It's absolutely shocking to discover the number of people who stay in abusive relationships because they are worried for the safety of their pet. And if we can provide short-term fostering for that cat, in our case, the Dogs Trust do the same thing, incidentally, for dogs. But if we can provide that support for a cat to enable a survivor to get out of an impossible situation and then be able to keep that cat safely, it stops being a lever for the abuser to use in the relationship, and we can then return the cat to its owner eventually. Once we've also persuaded, incidentally, the generation of landlords that having a pet in a house is an acceptable thing to do. That's a whole other area of campaigning that we're still really, really keen to keep pushing. That sort of link between animal welfare and human well-being, I think, makes us a really, really powerful organisation.
I don't know if there's any science to this, but you'd imagine that having a stress-free environment is an awful lot better for the cat as well than being stuck in an environment which might be abusive.
Yes,
maybe not directly to the cat, but
I mean, of course, what we're also doing is we're ensuring the welfare of the cat at the same time. Yeah. But there is something in there about that extra impact that I think just sets things aside. And we also work really, really hard, and our local branches work really, really hard to support. For instance, we have a program called Cat Guardians where and there is no charge for this at all. People can register their cat with us, particularly elderly folks who may be living on their own and their cat is their only companion, and they're really worried about what will happen to them when they die. And we work really hard. We have to work within our limits in terms of the number of places that we have available and so on and so forth. But what we look to do is to take a cat in on the death of its owner and be able to rehome that cat. And that's a really nice thing to be able to do.
Yeah. And maybe we talk about this quite a lot on the podcast. And you mention it in your documentation. You talk about community, you talk about movements, you talk about partnership. And already today you've hinted at some of this when we talked about membership as well, that what the supporter journey is through an organisation. And as you perfectly illustrated some of the issues around the CRM that sends out endless letters or emails to people as if they're completely different individuals, not joining the dots very often between their involvement in other asks or other engagements. Yet at the same time, as a membership body, one way to look at membership is always about actually it's a group of people united behind a cause who quite often want to act doing different things, but act in a way that's going to further that shared purpose. And that may be giving money, that may be buying, subscribing to the magazine, it may be volunteering, it may be something like campaigning, which they may not even consider volunteering. It may be fostering, which again, they may not consider volunteering. Who knows? For me, language doesn't really matter. Oh, there might be, and I saw some on your website, some of the sort of micro activities, and it was really nice to see that you're talking about, just doing something on social media, or what were the other examples I saw? Learning something about cats. Learning is a really important thing that we underestimate.
Absolutely. We have a community of gamers.
Really?
Yeah. Who, and influencers amongst gamers who have decided that the way that they can help the charity is to talk about their cats whilst they're online gaming with each other and just talking about the work of the charity and explaining our mission and vision. And that's really wonderful. And of course, there's a younger and very differently involved group of people. And I mean, I think we've tapped into that probably more successfully than many, many other charities, just because folks love their cats.
Yeah. But there's something, we often talk about communities of interest.
Yep.
And we talk about it a lot. I don't think many charities have quite cracked it in some cases. And that's a great example of a community of interest. It's people aren't always united by geography, although that's very powerful. And I'd love to hear more about your groups and your local branches later on. But actually, sometimes it really can connect people by those shared communities. The one I often talk about, I always love, is Good Gym, where people who are you're a runner, aren't you? So people are interested in exercise, and I around that love of exercise, but also go and do good deeds in the local community. Those kind of communities of interest, whether it's gamers or exercise or rugby.
No, absolutely.
I mean, it's untapped potential, I think, in the charity world.
Well, and I think it's also recognizing that you don't need to. Sorry, this is going to sound like a BGO, blinding glimpse of the obvious. But you don't have to remain in the same community. You can shift between different communities. And that, you was talking earlier about the life profile of a volunteer or a life profile of a supporter, and recognizing that you don't have to stay static.
Yeah.
And we have folks who, have started off by coming to volunteer as part of their Duke of Edinburgh's award as a cat care assistant in one of our centres, and have then moved through to take part in fundraising activity for us, have then moved to volunteer in one of our retail outlets, and then have come to work for us. And, that's just brilliant. And who knows what they might do in the future.
If volunteers power your organisation, here's something you'll want to hear. At Investing in Volunteers, we know great volunteering doesn't happen by accident. It happens when organisations commit to giving volunteers the very best experience, one that's safe, supportive, meaningful and genuinely impactful. That's why more than 1,000 organisations across the UK and Republic of Ireland have chosen Investing in Volunteers, the quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Whether you're a CEO looking to build a stronger culture or a volunteer manager wanting to boost retention and engagement, working with your designated experienced assessor gives you a clear, practical framework whilst also upskilling your team. And the best bit is not about perfection. It's about learning, improving and showing your volunteers they truly matter. Earlier this year, Prostate Cancer UK achieved their 3rd award and said that going through the assessment has been a valuable and insightful experience, a great opportunity to reflect, learn and grow. So if volunteers are part of your vision, make Investing in Volunteers part of your strategy. Find out more and sign up for your free no-obligation quote at investinginvolunteers.co.uk.
As a volunteer manager, you're asked to wear many hats. No doubt your inbox is overflowing. You're using tools that don't speak to each other. And quite frankly, more time than you'd like is spent on admin and manual tasks.
Volunteero exists for this exact reason. Volunteero helps volunteer managers bring all aspects of volunteer management into one easy-to-use, flexible system that can be molded to your exact needs. It is so much more than a database that sends out emails. It is an all-encompassing platform that empowers your volunteers to do more.
We hear amazing feedback from their clients that include the likes of the RAF Museum, the Royal Voluntary Service and Keach Hospice. So if you'd like to learn more, book a demo on their website, volunteero.org, or email them at hello@volunteero.org.
Then going back to something, I think we've started to unpack this a little bit in our conversation, but you said at the beginning, you believe the nature of volunteering is changing, and therefore part of your work is trying to prepare organisation, cats protection in this case, for that change in nature of volunteering. I'd love for us to have a bit of time looking upwards and outwards around that. And I'd be really interested in your take on what do you feel is changing and what do organizations need to do about that? I mean, particularly in the context of a 100-year-old organization, right, that we're talking about, because I think it's interesting that organizations that have endured for over 100 years or approaching 100 years, Scouts would be another interesting example of that. My sense of that is that they really know what their offer is. They have kind of key things that are the same in that organization, but they also are not afraid to innovate and change things and do things differently and be bold sort of around the edges of that without losing their identity of who they are and what's really important to them. To be really interested in sort of how you see those two things playing out, both what's changing, but also how Cats Protection as a 100-year-old organization can and needs to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's very wise, Matt. I worry about people who talk about, for instance, there being a crisis in volunteering, or the idea that people don't want to volunteer in the traditional way. The answer is, I believe people still do. And
absolutely,
we may need to be more flexible in terms of meeting people's decreased time that they can offer. But generally, our traditional activity, which is about fostering animals, working as volunteers in either our centres or our retail outlets, where we run charity shops, or involved at a local level with something very technical, which is TNVR, which stands for Trap, Neuter, Volunteer and Return. So that's going out and trapping a feral cat, taking it to the vet, having it vaccinated, having it neutered, and then returning it to its feral life. So that's quite technical, but it's a really important part of what we do. Those are always going to be the mainstay of our direct service provision. But we've already talked about the possibility of education activity becoming something really interesting for people. And that can be both face-to-face, it can also be online or hybrid. Talked about those gamers doing things and looking to find opportunities for I'm not sure I really understand the term micro-volunteering, but micro-volunteering opportunities right the way through to really sustained day in, day out volunteering, having that full range and letting people know that they are welcome to wherever they might wish to fit themselves seems to me to be the important thing. My sense is that we got ourselves down a little bit of a rabbit hole in the sector about 10, 15 years ago, when we started talking about creating a structure that welcomed all volunteering entirely on where the volunteer was, if you like. So the volunteer said, well, I want to come and do this, but I can only give an hour, and us accommodating that within our usual structures. And the problem there was we actually created for ourselves an unsustainable service to those volunteers that just couldn't work. So I think there's something about having, if you like, that smorgasbord of opportunities that allow for really rich and varied and diverse engagement. But the power of putting the smorgasbord in place, putting that buffet in place from which to choose, lies with the skill of the charity in making sure that every single offer that's on that table is properly sustainable, and that, of course, it has an impact on vision and mission, because we're not there to serve the volunteers primarily. We are there to ensure that we make the world better for cats and the people who live with them. And that there has to be an understanding and a give or take in that space. Otherwise that way lies.
Yeah.
I think I've become more pragmatic over the past 5-10 years,
Sure.
recognizing that we can't provide a completely varied volunteer opportunity.
Even the best smorgasbords restaurants in the world don't offer an endless menu of that has to be something about the chef's capacity.
As far as I can take it. Because if we're not careful, we're going to move into, chocolate fountains and things, and it's all going to get too complicated. I don't know. I know that I was advocating 15 years ago for entirely flexible volunteering. And I realized that what I was offering philosophically was wonderful,
Sure.
was completely impractical.
It's always a partnership. It's always a balance. There's risks involved as well. And we talked about some of those before. It's about offering choice and flexibility as much as you can, offering journeys, but it's not an endless carte blanche recipe to do what. Volunteers have to have some structures around. They can't just.
Yeah.
In some roles, you can do what you like, for sure. But in others, clearly there has to be some kind of safeguards. And
There does. But there also, the other side of the coin is there has to be more flexibility than we were offering 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think about some of the success that we have had as a charity, Cats Protection, that I'm really, really proud of. Not just in terms of volunteers, but also in terms of employees, in diversifying, particularly the neurodiversity of our volunteers and staff. The great thing about working with animals is that often they are more accommodating than human beings for a whole host of different reasons. And we need to ensure that we are able to offer great volunteering and staff opportunities to people with a really, really wide range of needs. And the number of folks that I've spoken to who have said, I tried volunteering with other charities, but actually I think I found my home here, has been, it makes me feel rather proud, actually.
So it should. It'd be nice to hear a little bit more about that neurodiversity work, because that is something that we don't hear much of. I've certainly not had on this podcast. And, you see bits in an EDI policy or something, but you don't actually really hear much of it in practice unless you're, working with Autistica or a charity that specialises in that kind of arena. I think listeners would like to hear a bit more, if that's okay, John.
Well, I mean, there are 2 or 3 things. I mean, particularly at the sharp end, number of our cat welfare assistants and those that come and volunteer in our centres have found, and I don't want to speak for them. And so I'm trying to choose. I'm not trying to choose words carefully because I want to be politically correct, although I like to think I was, but because I'm worried about making a blanket statement that is somehow a bit twee or whatever. But there is something around being able to spend time with animals, being welcomed to do so, to have a clear set of tasks that need to be undertaken that are themselves inherently safe. And I mean emotionally safe as well as physically safe, that mean that we can provide volunteering opportunities and staff opportunities, actually, that others don't have the privilege to be able to provide. And the feedback that we get is just great. And I had an email just a couple of weeks ago from somebody who came to volunteer for us in one of our centres in the southwest, then moved away for family reasons. And in fact, she's very anxious, and there are a whole host of challenges that she herself was meeting and was working, with us to be able to deal with. She has since got a degree. Is in a different space because she's learnt to manage various bits of her life in different ways. And it was writing to me to say, just so you know, John, we had a long chat 3 years ago, and it was lovely to chat about what I wanted to do. I've done this, I've done that, and now I'm ready to go and do some fundraising for the charity. And that fills me with joy for a whole host of different reasons, not least because somebody actually wants to tell me what's happened. And I just think that's just lovely. So that's a bit woolly, but I'm just really nervous, first of all, about making claims for us that perhaps are, overstated, but also about talking on behalf of people who we ought to be giving a voice to themselves.
Yeah. It may sound woolly, and I think sometimes in our world, we're in a world that changes people's lives. And when we're talking about anecdotal stories about individuals, it can come across as woolly. But actually, I think that's really important, because not for it to be woolly, it's really important to tell those stories about how the actions that we take. And as you said, the organisations about welfare of cats. But there's no getting away from the fact that volunteering and engagement, and sometimes staffing as well, in organisations like ours changes the lives of the individual people involved as well. And I don't think we should shy away from talking about those things, John.
And the other thing I would say is I'm telling the story of Cats Protection. I also recognise that there are hundreds of charities of different sizes that are all contributing towards seeing the world in a different way and through the eyes of volunteers in a different way than the way in which I experienced as a young volunteer, 40 years ago.
And what a great advocate I imagine that volunteer will be for cats and for cat protection as well with that experience.
I mean, she's brilliant. And I'm hoping that she will come and work with us in the governance and management of the organisation and help us to learn from her experience and expertise.
I wonder on the governance and management side, John, to sort of bring us a little bit back to some of the conversations we were having about power and some of the changes around that early on. I'd be interested in your reflections as a CEO of, clearly you've articulated you're in an organisation that needs to move fast, that needs to respond to the challenges that are presented to it. There's this pendulum swing you need to address around, the balance of voice and expertise within the organisation. How have you found, has there been a compromise there? Like, I suppose what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is, has involving more volunteers slowed things down, or has it actually made them more efficient and sped things up?
I think in every way it has improved the impact that we're having. Now, I mean, we've been a voluntary organisation forever. It's in our warp and weft. We have 10,000 folks and 1,000 staff. So if you don't work closely with folks, you're not going to have the impact anyway, because we wouldn't have the scale of work. I think what's been really interesting for me has been the way in which engaging folks through, so leave the direct service provision to one side and look at the rest of the charity. I think every single conversation has been enriched, and our perspective as decision makers has been made more vital through widening our lens to include a volunteer lens. Funnily enough, I was with a team of senior leaders within the organisation today, and one of the things that they were just floating was whether, as a group of people, and this is not making a big announcement or not, because there are still loads of things to think about, but it was really fascinating that a group of senior staff within the organisation was saying, next time we're looking for a chair of our particular group, I wonder if we should think about having a volunteer come and chair us independently. And I thought, crikey. Now, one of our values is courage and being courageous. And I thought, I don't believe we would have been even considering that 10, 15, 20 years ago, because that's just not the culture that's been within the organisation. And the trust then between volunteer and staff, for a senior leadership group of staff to say, I wonder if we would really benefit from having somebody else come and chair us than one of us. I was gobsmacked. Absolutely chuffed to bits.
So what are the building blocks for that, John, in your sense? Like, how do you get from a position, where you were 3 years ago to where you are today? What's the, what's the essence of creating that courage and that view? Like, how do you get people to trust one another and work together effectively? What are some of the key components from your perspective? Particularly if there are other organizations out here listening going, I would love a bit of that. Like, how can I get there? So,
I'm trying to think what we've done. It's a bit of remorseless positivity. And if you like, as chief executive, and I mean, I would add as chair of trustees as well, both saying this is a really important thing for us. So there's a little bit there in terms of role modeling. And then, of course, there is the recruitment of folks who are committed to that as a vision. So that's been really, really important. But for the most part, it's been about letting things build with their own momentum rather than imposing change too quickly. And what I've been really chuffed by is that various groups within the organisation have chosen to adopt a model of saying we need, and different language in different organisations, but we need a senior volunteer in this space as part of the team, or 2 or 3 or whatever. The adoption of that has been much faster than I would have expected. And I think that's probably just because folks have talked to each other about the positive wins that they've seen when they've tried it. So I'm not into throwing people into a cold swimming pool and expecting them to learn to swim. I'm into people dipping their toe in, maybe taking their toe out again for a bit and doing stuff. I mean, of course, we want to be impactful, and of course, we want to make things happen. But if you impose it too strongly, then I think you what you do is you then get the pushback. The other thing that we've done, which I think has been really important, has been to really examine our decision making as an organization. And Chris, you talked earlier about being on journeys and so on. And, I would hate to sit here this evening and suggest that we've cracked it all, because we sure as heck haven't. And there's loads more. And there will always be stuff to learn,
Yeah.
I know everybody says that, but I really believe it. But one of the things we've looked at trying to do is to be more thoughtful about where decisions are made within the organization and who needs to be part of that decision-making process. And we're using particularly a model that was created by Bain and Company about 25 years ago called Rapids, and you can Google it. I mean, it's today is not a primer for a particular model of decision-making. But what it says is you really want to have decision making undertaken, first of all, by the right person, but that person, and it should, whenever possible, be an individual. And then that person has the responsibility, if they're given the privilege of making the decision, then it is their responsibility to ensure that they ask the right people and consult with the right people to come to an intelligent reason for making a decision. And the various letters in the acronym RAPID stand for the different roles that people take in the decision-making process. But by putting that in place within the organization begs the question, so where is the end user in this? Where is the volunteer in this conversation? Where is the beneficiary? And that means that you are almost in a state where it is a blinding glimpse of the obvious that you must engage folks from a wide variety in that consultation process and that decision-making process.
It sounds to me, you sound like a CEO who puts a lot of onus on culture and a lot of onus on vision. I'm not saying you don't focus on strategy, I'm sure that's there as well. But you seem to me, John, somebody who recognises that you can have the best strategy in the world, but if you don't get those culture stuff right, it's all going to fall apart at the seams.
It's really interesting, Chris. In previous charities, I have been the one who has created, and obviously with colleagues, but I've been the instigator of strategic development. This is the first place I've come to work where the strategy was in place, and that my appointment was part of that process. So they had, the charity had already decided that what it wanted to do over 10 years. Part of that was changing its culture, and it deliberately sought out a chief executive who, as you say, was really fascinated by culture and people as part of that process. And when I looked at my senior leadership team, it was really important for me to have representation at the highest level in the charity, not just of operational experts, but the people director, people and culture director. In some charities, that would be seen as a level that might be on an operational group rather than a leadership group. But I felt really strongly that was, I only want a few seats around the table. People and culture had to be there.
I don't want to let you go, John, without asking some questions about branches and retail, because they're two of the most, I suppose, the most common roles across the volunteering world, but also the things that when I speak to clients and when I speak to volunteering managers, where a lot of the questions come up about how to really make a really effective communities, I guess, around both of those kind of roles, and how to get the best out of those. So have you got any sort of nuggets of wisdom that you would say, what makes a really successful volunteering retail role and what makes a successful volunteering branch?
I think I'd answer that slightly differently, in that I think we are absolutely on a really fascinating trajectory as our volunteers feel more and more, I hope, that they're part of a UK-wide charity, as well as supporting their immediate local community. And we're just about to really get engaged in a real milestone of a conversation. And it will be a conversation with our volunteer branches around how we manage finances effectively together and how we make the most of the resources that we've got. I said we're one charity, we're not a set of federated charities, but in many ways our processes and our behaviours are not dissimilar to a set of federated individual autonomous charities, despite the fact that reality is something quite different. And those processes continue a narrative which says, in my branch, in wherever it might be in the country, I am both responsible for raising all my money and I want to hold on to it. And what's happened over recent years has been a desire from branches to support other branches in less privileged areas of the country. So, we have a mismatch where we have some branches that are remarkably able to raise loads and loads of money, but don't have a big volunteer base to be able to do direct cat work. And we have other parts of the country where we've got loads of people who really, really are there and ready to help, but the resources aren't there to be able to equip them. And branches have been brilliant. We have a fund called the One Charity Fund, where branches give some of their money into that pot, and then that pot gets divvied out to those that make applications. Now, my problem with that is that continues the story that we have a set with money here and they're giving it to the less fortunate, rather than saying, actually, we're all one charity here.
It's all about cats.
And it's all about cats. And we just need to make this money move as swiftly as we can around the charity. That conversation around, so what do we need to do with our processes to make that easier for everybody, and build trust, not just branch to branch? Because if you'd met Cats Protection 30 or 40 years ago, branches, there were turf wars over who was raising money where, and lots of people will recognize that in other organizations. We don't have that so much now, I'm glad to say. But the next stage is, okay, so do we have trust in, first of all, the centre to spend money as it should be spent? And do we have trust in each other to be able to have a much more holistic attitude towards all the processes that we go through and where the charitable money of our organisation is stored and spent?
Yeah. It'd be interesting to channel a bit of RNLI when you've got all these places completely inland, sort of happily raising money, but actually it's for people, whether they're in rivers or on sea, who need it. It doesn't really matter where it's spent. But yes, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because you have individual people we build communities around geography because it works for us as organisations as well, because that makes them successful. But yes, then they think that local cats or local people need the money, and cats don't have postcodes, do they?
You're so right. There are two challenges for us. The first is, of course, many people both give and volunteer for their local communities. And if we ignore that, then we do so at our peril. However, if we are going to genuinely change the cat welfare story in this country, then quite a lot of our investment of resource needs to be, in the theory of change, upstreamed.
I think that's such an important area, John, and it's a tension I think that plays out in lots of different charities in lots of different contexts. And when you layer on the complexity of what we started talking about earlier as well, which is the kind of the boundaries, the frameworks within which people operate as well, it adds that additional layer of complexity on, doesn't it? And the changing nature of volunteering. It's like all of these things kind of collide as the perfect kind of storm of how do you create a sort of flexible framework that people feel safe and comfortable and want to be a part of, that produces an effective volunteer experience, but also leverages kind of all of that time, all of that skill to achieve a grand objective rather than a small objective, because we're stronger together, right? If you look back 100 years, this wasn't to help this particular community, it was to help everyone, right? And I think that's, how can we be separate, but also, or how can we be local, but how can we have the biggest impact we can together?
Absolutely right. And the challenge that I think we have is that as charities, we try to, the old story about, eating the elephant a little bit at a time. The problem here is that actually to affect real change, we can't do that. Because if you only change one process, then you're not really changing the complete narrative and the complete understanding of the culture and change that we want to have. And so where we're sitting is we need to have a conversation. We need to have a really grown up, adult to adult conversation across the charity about what it is our strategy is trying to deliver, and what we need all to do in lots of little places of the charity to effect that culture change. If we only tweak it over here, then actually all we do is we may extend the myth that exists over here. We have to do it all at once. And so at the moment, we've just started a massive conversation, which we're calling Strategy Reconnect, which is about going out and listening to folks from every part of the charity, staff and volunteers, not about what our strategic aim should be, because we agreed those, but about the method we're going to now adopt, having put all the solid foundations in place. What are we now going to do to make that step change and really motor as an organization? And I've got to say, I mean, I am absolutely knocked out by the quality of conversation that is going on right the way through the organization, and the joy that folks are having in talking about bits of the charity that they normally have nothing to do with. So I had a wonderful conversation just last week. It was facilitated by a very, very brilliant colleague. Members of our marketing and income generation team were talking about cat welfare. And they said, this is brilliant. Our views have never been asked about this sort of stuff. And it was just a joy to have that going on. Hopefully the impact will be great.
Well, John, it's been a joy for us this evening to have you talking to us. It's been heartwarming and inspiring as we hoped it would be, particularly how you involve in the whole organisation in this journey and taking them, but also how thoughtful and well thought through and clearly deeply thought through the whole sort of strategy of involving volunteers and involving your members and your supporters in your organisation in a way that delivers for cats and for society. I mean, it is great. And
that's really kind, Chris.
No, it's true. It's true.
I should say that, it doesn't always feel like that as a chief executive. And then you look and you see the skills and qualities of those folks who are really doing what you've just described, and both the intensity with which they are approaching the challenge, but also the real empathy that they show and compassion that they show. And I just, I feel very lucky to be working with amazing people.
Yeah, and I'm sure that from what I've heard tonight, that the organisation's in very good hands, not just with you yourself, but with those individuals. And I'm also sure that those listening, who are mostly volunteer leaders of some description, sometimes CEOs, would have an awful lot to take away and to ponder for their own organisations, which is the whole reason for this podcast. So thank you for that. And I also ought to say that my namesake, Jesse Wade, I'm sure would look at what you've done as an organisation with some pride, but also recognise that the journey that you've gone on, but actually that you've kept to some of the initial instincts and drivers of the organisations. At least that's my take anyway. So, thanks for joining us, John. Thanks for giving up a bit of your evening. Maybe in a year or two's time, we'll ask you back if that's okay and see how things have progressed.
I'd be chuffed.
Well, Chris, I have had the privilege of meeting John several times, and particularly with my scouting hat on, but also in some slightly different contexts as well. And every time I have the pleasure of spending time with John, I always leave feeling like I think a little bit differently about things. John's always got a good story to tell. He's always got something inspiring to say. And I think this one was no different. I'm really struck by how he views his role as a CEO in kind of framing the culture that really addresses that kind of pendulum shift of involving and working in partnership with volunteers. And it seems to me that that's kind of a real core component of how he's going about doing his role and key facet of his leadership at Cats Protection. And it seems like it's being really successful for them and giving them some really good results. I'm sure it's not easy. I'm sure they're on a journey. I'm sure there's things to move forwards with, but it feels like putting the right people at the heart of the right decisions and being courageous in that and hearing new and different voices, trusting people, all of that seems to be a really key thing that he is trying to bring about at Cats Protection. And yeah, I'm really pleased to hear it.
That's a really good summary. It's the first time I've met John. I really, really liked him. I just thought he was a genuine thoughtful leader of people, volunteers or staff or others, who didn't simplify things. He could see the complexity and the dichotomy in some of the challenges that we face. He could see the advantages, for instance, of partnership and autonomy, but also the risks, and was taking a very pragmatic but thoughtful view on what's the best way to cut through that, but equally not having to come up with all the answers himself. Well, this didn't strike me as one of these leaders who has all the answers and everybody follows, although I'm sure he has a lot of them in his mind. He's one that is listening, is enabling others, and gently steering the ship in a way that takes everybody on a journey, enhances and gets the best out of their abilities and their experiences and helps them develop. So, my kind of leader, for sure. I think his views on volunteering were clearly really well informed, really philosophical, but well thought through again, quite progressive without being reactionary or over the top about things. I liked the way when he talks about new things, so some of the stuff around neurodiversity, or the work to house cats in the advent of domestic abuse, or even just moving into things like the gaming example, that he clearly lit up when he talked about those things. So he's obviously somebody who really wants to see how can we move things forward, how can we make things better all the time. But he didn't do that in a table thumping kind of way. It felt like a very patient, balanced way. And he said something which caught my attention, letting things build with their own momentum, not always forcing them. That's not a mantra I often hear from leaders, because naturally enough, leaders of all organizations are often impatient and want to get things done. And I sense there's ambition with John, that he wanted things to keep developing, but he understood about doing things and helping to build the momentum rather than force the actual specific agenda. And I thought that was really interesting and really mature leadership thinking.
It's an interesting principle, isn't it? Because sometimes the best thing you can do as a leader is actually get out of the way and let good people get on with things. You set the vision and be clear about what the focus is, and then get out of the way and let things happen with their own momentum.
I didn't sense he was getting out of the way, but I sense he was an enabling leader rather than...
Yeah, possibly. I suppose I was saying getting out of the way in the sense, in terms of, we don't always need people cracking the whip. What we need is people to enable, as you say.
So I think there's lots and lots to take away from a pragmatic point of view in terms of shaping our own volunteering leadership activity. But actually, I think there's some really great lessons in leadership in there from John. But whether in volunteering or something else, I think there's something to take away is for our aspiring leaders who are listening, about a way to really manage an organization or to lead an organization. So thank you, John, for joining us. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. You've stayed to the end, so that must mean something. Please do give us a like or a rating. Please do share the podcast with friends and colleagues who you think might be interested. We'd always appreciate that. And do leave comments, suggestions maybe of future guests. We're always open to ideas. But until then, thanks for joining us. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, John.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.